The hoofbeats don't thunder. They shuffle, a dry, tired rhythm of leather and dust. It is early July, and the sun has turned the hills of Galilee into a furnace. A knight in the rear guard lifts his visor just long enough to wipe sweat from his eyes. And when he looks up, he sees it. Not an army, but a horizon moving, a shimmer of steel and white robes. Saladin's banners. For a moment there is silence. Then someone shouts, not a battle cry, a warning. This is not how the Crusaders imagined their end. For 87 years, the Franks of Jerusalem had ruled the Levant like they were invincible. They built castles of dazzling white limestone. They baptized conquered mosques. They told themselves that God wanted them there. And because God wanted them there, no desert wind and no Muslim general could ever push them out. But in the spring of 1187, that certainty began to rot from the inside. The kingdom of Jerusalem was a knife's edge balanced on betrayal. Its king, the young Baldwin IV, had died a slow, horrifying death from leprosy, leaving a child king on the throne and two rival factions, tearing the nobility apart. On one side stood Raymond of Tripoli, a pragmatic lord who believed peace with Saladin was the only path to survival. On the other stood Guy of Lusignan, the newly crowned king by marriage, a man many considered a reckless fool. And caught between them were the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, whose hot-blooded raids kept breaking every truce Raymond tried to build. Saladin watched from Cairo and Damascus, and he waited. By June, the fuse had been lit. A reckless Templar knight named Reynald de Chatillon, a man with a reputation for sadistic cruelty, attacked a Muslim caravan traveling peacefully toward Arabia. He dragged the merchants into his castle and laughed when they begged for mercy. Worse, he threatened to march on Mecca itself. For Saladin, this was not a provocation. It was a gift. The Sultan had spent years uniting the fractured cities of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia under a single banner, jihad. But he needed a cause to rally his emirs. Reynald handed him one. Dripping with blood, Saladin swore an oath in his tent. He would personally cut off Reynald's head. The Crusader army mustered near the springs of Sephoria, a rare source of water in the bone-dry landscape. Guy of Lusignan had perhaps 50,000 men on paper, but the real fighting force was closer to 20,000, including 1,200 knights. They had water, they had a defensive position, and Raymond of Tripoli begged them to stay put. Let Saladin come to us, he argued. He cannot take our castles if we hold the wells. For 2 days the Crusaders waited. The heat shimmered. The horses grew restless. And then Saladin made a move that changed everything. He marched his army around the Crusader, flank and laid siege to the city of Tiberias, specifically, the fortress where Raymond's own wife, Eshiva, was trapped with her children. The messengers arrived at Guy's tent in a cloud of dust. The Lady Eshiva is under attack. The city is burning. Now the argument turned vicious. Raymond urged caution. Tiberias could fall, but the kingdom would survive if the army lived. But the Templars shouted him down. Coward, they hissed. You only want to save your wife's skin. Guy of Lusignan, desperate to prove he was not weak, gave the order to march. At dawn on July 3rd, the entire Crusader army left the safety of Sephoria and stepped into a world of stone and fire. The first hour was hard. By the third, men were dying of thirst without a single arrow being shot. The Crusaders had misjudged the distance to the next water source, a plateau called the Horns of Hattin. Saladin's archers, mounted on swift horses, swarmed the edges of the column like wolves. They didn't charge. They didn't need to. They simply loosed arrows into the packed infantry and then vanished into the dust. By noon, the knights were on foot. Their armor turned into ovens. Men ripped off their helmets just to breathe, and the Saracen archers shot them down where they stood. A chronicler would later write that the Crusaders wept from thirst, not fear. And then, as the sun began to tilt toward the horizon, Guy realized the truth. Saladin hadn't been trying to kill them yet. He had been hurting them. The army was now trapped on a dry, barren hill with no water, no retreat, and the entire Muslim army circling below like a noose tightening. The night of July 3rd was worse than the battle. There is a specific cruelty to thirst that most histories forget to mention. It isn't just a dry throat. It is a thickening of the blood, a cracking of the lips, a dizziness that turns the horizon into a spinning blur. The Crusaders huddled on the Horns of Hattin, two volcanic hills rising out of the plateau, and they listened to the sound of their own failure. Below them, Saladin's campfires burned in a perfect ring, thousands of small flames that seemed to mock the stars. And then the wind shifted. Saladin gave an order that broke the Crusaders before the first sword was drawn. He told his men to light the dry brush surrounding the hill. The fire spread fast. Thorns and dead grass exploded into sheets of orange light, and the smoke, thick, acrid, choking, rolled up the slopes like a living thing. Knights covered their mouths with wet rags, but there was no water left. Men coughed until they vomited. Horses screamed and broke their tethers, galloping blindly into the darkness, where Saladin's skirmishers waited with lances. By dawn, the Crusader army was not a fighting force. It was a collection of dying men who had not slept, had not drunk, and could barely see. The sun rose blood-red through the haze, and Saladin attacked. He did not commit his heavy cavalry first. Instead, wave after wave of horse archers rode up the slopes, loosed their arrows, and peeled away. The tactic was ancient but flawless. Each arrow found gaps in the Crusader armor, armpits, throats, eyes. The knights raised their shields, but the arrows came from left, right, and above. A hospitaller monk in white armor took 3 shafts in the chest and fell without a word. Beside him, a young squire watched his master die and simply sat down in the dust. He did not rise again. Guy of Lusignan tried to rally his knights for a charge. The charge was the Franks' great weapon, the irresistible weight of armored horses, crashing into disordered infantry. But on the horns of Hattin, there was no room to accelerate. The slopes were too steep, the horses too exhausted. When Guy gave the order, perhaps 200 knights managed to form a ragged line. They kicked their mounts into a trot. They lowered their lances, and they rode directly into Saladin's center. For a moment it almost worked. The first rank of Muslim infantry buckled and broke. Men screamed in Arabic and French, the languages mixing in the chaos of impact. But Saladin had placed his own elite guard behind the line. Mamluk, warriors mounted on fresh horses. They countercharged into the Crusader flank. And suddenly the knights were surrounded, not charging. A knight named Balian of Ibelin later said it was like fighting the sea. For every man you cut down, 2 more appeared. The turning point came at mid-morning. The Crusaders still held one hilltop. They still had the relic of the true cross, a piece of wood they believed made their army invincible. A bishop carried it into battle on a golden litter. And as long as the cross stood, men fought. But Saladin's archers had been aiming for that litter all morning. An arrow struck the bishop's hand. He dropped the cross. Another arrow hit the priest carrying it. The relic tumbled into a gully filled with blood and ash. When the Crusaders saw the true cross fall, something inside them snapped. Faith had been their last anchor. Without it, there was only panic. Raymond of Tripoli, the man who had begged Guy not to march, finally led a desperate charge down the western slope. His knights cut through the Muslim lines, not because they were stronger, but because Saladin had quietly ordered his men to open a gap. The Sultan wanted Raymond to escape. He knew that a defeated general, alive and shamed, would spread chaos in Jerusalem's court more effectively than a corpse. Raymond rode through the gap and did not look back. Behind him, the rest of the Crusader army collapsed. Now came the slaughter. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a hunt. Saladin's men moved up the slopes in disciplined lines, spearing the wounded, cutting down those too weak to lift their swords. The Templars and Hospitallers fought to the last man, literally, surrounding themselves with their dead horses. They stood back to back and died under a hail of arrows. A chronicler would write that the ground turned into a carpet of white mantles, stained red. By noon it was over. Guy of Lusignan knelt in the dirt, stripped of his armor, and begged for water. Saladin watched him for a long moment. Then he ordered a servant to bring a cup of rosewater, chilled with snow from Mount Hermon. Guy drank greedily, but Saladin reminded him a man who shared water with a prisoner was promising to spare his life. The Sultan kept his word. He spared the king. He did not spare Renaud de Chatillon. The tent was cool, shaded by yellow silk that rippled in the afternoon breeze. Saladin sat on a carpet, cross-legged, his face unreadable. Guards in steel caps and chainmail flanked the entrance. Outside, 20,000 Crusader prisoners knelt in the dust, their hands bound with rope, their eyes hollow. And in front of the Sultan, still wearing the blood-stained tunic of a man who had laughed at peace, stood Renaud de Chatillon. Renaud had been a problem for 2 decades. He had raided Red Sea ports. He had tortured prisoners for amusement. He had broken truces like other men broke bread. And now, for the first time in his life, the old knight looked genuinely afraid. His beard was matted with sweat and ash. His hands trembled at his sides. Saladin offered him the same cup of iced rosewater. This was a ritual of the age. In the Islamic world, offering water to a captive meant offering mercy. Renaud reached for the cup, but Saladin pulled it back. "I did not give it to you," the Sultan said quietly. "I gave it to the king." He turned to an interpreter. "Tell this man, you gave him no water." Renaud's face went pale. He understood immediately. Some sources suggest Saladin then stood, walked to Reynold, and offered him a choice: convert to Islam or die. Other accounts, more dramatic and perhaps less reliable, claim the Sultan drew his own scimitar and struck Reynold's shoulder with a single blow. What is not debated is the outcome. Saladin stepped outside the tent. He summoned his guards, and he personally executed Reynold de Chatillon, cutting him down where he knelt. The Sultan did not stop there. He ordered the execution of every captured Templar and Hospitaller. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was strategy. The military orders were the Crusaders' deadliest weapon. Trained killers who took no ransoms and offered no quarter. Saladin knew that if he let them live, they would return to their castles and fight for another decade. So in the shadow of the horns of Hattin, his men beheaded nearly 200 monks in white mantles. The prisoners prayed in Latin, the executioners spoke in whispers, and the blood soaked into the same dry earth that had already drunk so much of it. But the common soldiers? The footmen, the squires, the cooks and blacksmiths who had followed their lords to war. Saladin released most of them. It was a calculated act of mercy. A starving, weaponless man wandering toward Jerusalem would consume food, spread terror, and drain the city's morale. A dead man did none of those things. Within a week, the news reached the walls of Jerusalem. The holy city, the prize of the First Crusade, the jewel that generations of Europeans had bled for, now stood alone. Its garrison had been destroyed at Hattin. Its king was a prisoner. Its relics were scattered. And Saladin's army, fresh from victory and hungry for glory, was marching south. What happened next shocked even the Muslim chroniclers. Saladin did not rush. He methodically captured every fortress along the coast: Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, each one falling like ripe fruit. The Crusader barons who had once mocked the Sultan's patience now watched from their towers as their world collapsed, city by city. And yet, Jerusalem itself prepared for a siege with the desperation of a cornered animal. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few lords who had escaped Hattin, rode to the holy city with a single purpose. He found the streets filled with refugees. He found the churches overflowing with women praying. And he found exactly 2 knights willing to fight. The rest had died on the horns of Hattin. Balian did something remarkable. He knighted every boy over 16. He armed priests and merchants. He melted down church silver to buy arrows and boiling oil. And when Saladin's army arrived outside the walls in late September, the Sultan looked up at the towers of Jerusalem and saw not a broken city, but a city that refused to die quietly. The siege lasted 12 days. The first breach came on September 29th. Saladin's sappers had spent a week digging tunnels beneath the northern wall, their picks scratching in the darkness like mice in a tomb. When the supports collapsed, a section of stone, 50 feet wide, crumbled into a cloud of white dust. Through the gap, the Muslim army saw the streets of Jerusalem, narrow, twisting, silent. But Balian of Ibelin had not been idle. He stationed his best archers on the rooftops overlooking the breach. And when the first wave of attackers poured through, they met a storm of arrows and boiling oil. Men screamed, horses reared, the gap became a killing zone, and Saladin, watching from a hilltop, ordered a withdrawal. He had lost perhaps 500 men in an hour. The city's defenders cheered. Their joy lasted one night. The next morning, Saladin moved his siege engines to a different section of the wall. Then another, then another. He had the resources to attack from every direction at once. The defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, could only run from one breach to the next, plugging holes with their own bodies. By the 3rd day of fighting, Balian knew the truth. Jerusalem would fall. The only question was whether its people would live. He sent a messenger to Saladin's camp under a flag of truce. The terms were brutal. Saladin demanded every Christian pay a ransom, 10 gold pieces for a man, 5 for a woman, 2 for a child. Those who could not pay would become slaves. Balian swore that the defenders would burn the city to the ground before surrendering on those terms. "We will destroy the Dome of the Rock," he warned. "We will kill our own families. You will inherit nothing but ash." Historians debate whether Balian actually meant this, or whether it was a desperate bluff. But it worked. Saladin, who had spent his life building a reputation for mercy, lowered the ransom. Thousands of poor Christians were allowed to leave without payment. The Patriarch of Jerusalem emptied the church, treasuries to buy freedom for the rest. And on October 2nd, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem swung open, not to conquerors, but to an army that entered in silence. Saladin forbade looting. He forbade massacre. When his soldiers began weeping with joy at seeing the city where the Prophet Muhammad had ascended to heaven, the Sultan reminded them that victory meant nothing without dignity. The Christian refugees streamed out of the city in columns that stretched for miles. Women carried children on their shoulders. Old men leaned on wooden crosses. A knight who had lost his arm in the siege walked barefoot toward the coast, where ships would carry him back to Europe. And Saladin watched them go. He did not gloat. According to a Muslim chronicler standing beside him, the Sultan's eyes were wet. "How many have we killed?" he asked quietly. No one answered. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Christendom. In Rome, the Pope collapsed in grief. In London, King Henry II cancelled a hunting trip and called for a new crusade. In Germany, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa began raising the largest army Europe had seen in a century. The loss of the Holy City would haunt the West for generations, fueling a cycle of vengeance that would not end for another 100 years. But in that moment, on the dusty road outside Jerusalem, with the sound of weeping filling the air and the banners of Islam flying over the walls, Saladin had done what no Muslim leader had accomplished in nearly a century. He had taken back Jerusalem, not with a massacre, not with a betrayal, but with patience, discipline, and a single devastating battle fought on a dry, forgotten hill called Hattin. The Crusaders had thought their kingdom was eternal. They had built castles of stone. They had filled churches with gold. They had forgotten that empires do not fall because of enemies. They fall because of arrogance. And on the horns of Hattin, arrogance met the desert.